Welcome to UD Talks, the podcast brought to you by United Drug, Ireland's leading pharmaceutical wholesaler and distributor. Along with our host, Denis O'Driscoll, we're here to bring you the latest insights, trends, and innovations in retail pharmacy. Each episode, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to you, from cutting-edge pharmaceutical developments to the day-to-day challenges faced by retail pharmacies. We'll be joined by industry experts to share insights and explore the future of pharmacy in Ireland. UD Talks is your go-to source for staying informed and inspired.
The content of this podcast is intended for pharmacists, healthcare professionals, and individuals with a professional interest in community pharmacy. While every effort has been made to ensure the accuracy of the content within this podcast, United Drug cannot accept responsibility for any mistakes, errors, or inaccuracies. Listeners are strongly advised to verify the information contained in this podcast with a relevant healthcare provider or seek medical advice where appropriate before acting on any information provided. United Drug shall not be liable for any loss or damage arising from the use of the information contained in this podcast. This disclaimer operates to limit United Drug's liability under contract, tort, including negligence, or statute. This disclaimer is provided to ensure that listeners are aware of the limitations of liability before they rely on the content. By continuing to listen to this podcast, listeners signify their assent to this disclaimer.
Hi everyone and welcome to our podcast today. We're delighted to have Joanne Kissane, the Registrar of the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland, here with us today, and we have multiple and many questions to ask her, which I'm sure of great interest to pharmacists currently. So I guess, Joanne, let's open up and ask you the very wide and broad question is, what do you think have been the greatest achievements so far and the barriers that have kind of cropped up in trying to maybe get those achievements over the line, or what you see as the next achievements?
Thanks a million, first and foremost, Denis, for having me here today, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to the broad range of pharmacists that you currently engage with. I think a very broad question to start off with, but what I suppose, obviously the PSI as the pharmacy regulator has been in place since 2007. And, there's been many successes over that time, and I definitely can't claim credit for all of them. The Act itself started the fundamentals of regulation. And I suppose, there's been many successes. So registration of pharmacists, pharmacies, code of conduct for pharmacists, CPD process for pharmacists, the creation of the IAOP. So there's been many successes. But I suppose in particular, over the last 2 years, well, not quite 2 years since I've been registrar, there's been a huge change in, I suppose, the appreciation for pharmacists and recognition of what pharmacists can deliver for as part of the integrated healthcare system. So it's been really exciting for me to be part of the expert task force that looked at the expansion of scope of pharmacy. And I suppose the recommendations that have come out of that, and I presume we'll have many questions and conversation about the expansion of the scope. The other things I suppose that I'm quite proud of, and again, they were started perhaps before I became registrar, were the workforce intelligence report. And that provided a real insight into the risks in terms of the Irish context of not being able to sustain sufficient pharmacists for patient-facing roles. And it identified a number of actions and recommendations that PSI, together with a number of other stakeholders, need to implement in order to ensure that we have consistent supply of pharmacists in those vital patient roles. We've also, in the last 2 years, reviewed the continuing professional development model for pharmacists. And I suppose there's been some positive and will be some positive outcomes of that review, including the removal, for example, of practice review. And also, I suppose, some important patient safety initiatives as part of that in the context of linking continuing registration to the completion of CPD by pharmacists, which is currently something that's not in place. So it can be a significant risk to patients and the public, and it's extremely small numbers, but it's still happening. Pharmacists are not actually engaging in continuing professional development, but can continue to remain on our register. And the only process that we have in order to deal with that at the moment, and we try extensively to engage with pharmacists before we go down a regulatory fitness to practice approach. But unfortunately, we've had a couple of circumstances over the last number of years where we've had to use the fitness to practice approach. So it's a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut in those circumstances. And meanwhile, the risk to patients and the public remains because you have a pharmacist who is not engaging in continuing professional development. So a number of different things, I suppose, that we're really proud of. Task force is probably front and foremost of everyone's minds, I would say, at present.
Okay, that's great. And just to go back, what was interesting there throughout what you said is it would appear that there's a huge change in how pharmacy is appreciated and perceived. And the task force certainly, and I think pharmacy stepping up during COVID is definitively the defining moment for a profession. But the task force has come out with recommendations. So I'm old, as you well know, and there's going to be this kind of like, some people kind of go, I'm just not able to do all these changes. Do you think that there will be kind of a different tiering in pharmacy as we go forward, that there'll be, I don't want to use the word specialist pharmacies because I think that's wrong, because community pharmacy should remain at the heart of the community, but do you think there'll be like specialist services offered in certain pharmacies versus other locations, just because of the ability and willingness to move forward as a profession?
And I suppose that'll be linked, Denis, potentially in terms of how any future contractual negotiations with the PCRS, so there's any number of ways, I suppose, in which a pharmacist's career might change over the next while. So I suppose the first recommendation was around prescription extension. So that piece of legislation and that enabling legislation came into place on the 1st of March, and pharmacists can now extend prescriptions from the 1st of September. And I suppose what's interesting about that change for pharmacists is pharmacists were already extending prescriptions and making decisions around extending prescriptions during the pandemic, when prescriptions could be dispensed for periods of up to 9 months. And now that the legislative framework is there and in place to support pharmacists to extend prescriptions when they consider it to be appropriate and following a number of key criteria, some pharmacists are reluctant, certainly, to take on that sense of accountability. And this is a cultural change for pharmacists. And I suppose the big thing for all of us to recognise, regardless of what role we're in, be that the regulator, those in governance roles, practicing pharmacists itself, is that this is a change to how you've been practicing. And these changes, recommendation 1 and the recommendations coming out of the second phase, which are around prescribing for common conditions, and then ultimately independent autonomous pharmacist prescribing, are cultural shifts and changes. And pharmacists are very comfortable at the moment in their comfort zone. You're known as a dispenser, you're an expert in medicines, you have skills, competencies, fantastic education and training to support that role. And now we're moving into, I suppose, there's that period of fear, maybe trepidation around change of scope. And then there's going to be that period of, I suppose, learning and becoming more acquainted with it, and ultimately growth. So we all need to recognise that this is a cultural change. And some pharmacists will certainly engage with each of the recommendations. And I would see that over the next number of years, we'll have pharmacists who will be independent autonomous prescribers within a scope of practice within community pharmacy, as well as in, hospital pharmacy, and indeed primary care in terms of maybe in nursing homes or working in GP practices. The models of care obviously still have to be designed and created and agreed with the HSE and the Department of Health. But equally, there will be pharmacists who may choose not to embrace any of these changes, and that's absolutely fine. We've seen in other jurisdictions, though, I suppose Wales is a good one to look at, whereby the provision of these additional services has now been tied into the contract. So in order to get the enhanced payments for contracts in Wales, pharmacists and the pharmacies that they work in must engage with those additional services. Now, I can't, comment as to what might happen in the Irish context, but that is a possibility, that something like that might happen.
And you mentioned there that it's a pivotal change in pharmacy. How would you see the PSI, encouraging pharmacists to be part of this huge change for our profession? And I know that in the past you've mentioned using a hammer to break a nut with regards, bringing people through certain formats, the whole thing about compassionate regulation, and how you can see that compassionate regulation equally supporting pharmacists to actually take on these extra duties, extra pieces of work in order to progress our profession.
Well, I suppose most pharmacists are looking for this. So the Workforce Intelligence Report in 2023 and then the survey that we completed again in 2024 show that the vast majority of the profession do want this expanded scope. With expanded scope, comes accountability. And obviously that in itself, for some people, can bring that reluctance to participate. And we also recognise that those who took on governance and accountability roles felt very much the burden of that accountability taking on those roles. So that accountability will certainly, from a pharmacist perspective, possibly be quite forefront to their minds in terms of this shift to new services. Our role is very much around ensuring that the appropriate regulatory and governance frameworks are in place. And then as part of that, developing the appropriate standards and the guidelines for pharmacists in order to support and assist them to deliver it. And then obviously to prepare and to support them with any relevant training and education that's appropriate to the service that they may be providing. So there'll be a different approach taken for prescription extension versus the prescribing for common conditions versus becoming an independent autonomous prescriber. So we're very much, and the approach that we've taken as part of prescription extension has been about supporting pharmacists through the journey. So we developed a suite of guidelines and reviewed our medicines therapy review, counselling and prescription extension guidelines. We supported pharmacists through webinars, and we'll continue to do that. We had planned for an additional webinar for prescription extension. That's obviously been postponed at the moment in the context of where we are with prescription extension, and that it obviously, I suppose, really hasn't been rolled out since the 1st of September. We've developed a suite of FAQs and supporting guidelines, communication on our website. And I suppose within the PSI, there is a number of colleagues who are ready to respond to any queries and to support pharmacists throughout it. So we will put the appropriate structures in place to support pharmacists throughout these changes. And it's, it'll be then for pharmacists to engage with those. But we also have established a pharmacist panel because we're very mindful that for those of us in PSI, we're not practicing at the moment. We need to understand what are the supports that pharmacists are seeking from the PSI as part of any of this change. And following the recommendation and the acceptance of the first recommendation by the Minister for Health around prescription extension, we met with that pharmacist panel to understand what type of resources and supports that pharmacists were seeking. And that was very helpful to us in the context of us preparing the relevant supports for pharmacists. So while we have to have the right structures in place, we're there to support pharmacists in order to be able to deliver these services safely in the public interest.
Okay, and I guess the first step, and maybe my comment on it, was towards this whole ideology around compassionate regulations. It's probably, from my perspective as a superintendent pharmacist, was the use of a principle-based decision-making tool. And also in that, I felt, and maybe you might comment on this, is a lot of pharmacists don't respect their own clinical autonomy and tend to be subservient to others. And I believe that whole principle piece might bring us to that where we stand on our own feet in a solid way as an autonomous professional. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, and within the PSI, we very much believe that pharmacists have the appropriate skills, competencies, training and education in order to be able to deliver on these services. The pharmacy degree that all of us completed in order to become registered pharmacists adequately prepares pharmacists to deliver on these services, with the addition of some appropriate continuing professional development. We all always need to keep learning. And we're moving as a PSI from prescriptive type standards guidelines, which pharmacists are very used to, and which pharmacists...
They like black and white, Joanne. They like black
absolutely,
and white.
And which is very, I suppose, supportive of the type of personality perhaps that a lot of pharmacists have said, as you said, like black and white, like it to be very clear. But the principles-based approach allows a pharmacist to be able to deliver on that service, recognising that they have the skills and competencies to do so and don't need a checklist from the PSI in order to be able to deliver it. Now, again, I spoke about a cultural shift for pharmacists. And I know when I was superintendent and when I was supervising and in pharmacy, there's nothing better than a checklist to say, if I have gone A to Z and I've ticked all these boxes, I'm providing a good service. What we're saying is, and I suppose it supports also innovation within pharmacy. It supports the fact that not all pharmacies are the same. We're adopting a principles-based approach. And if you meet that principle, we'll have a number of indicators for you to be able to work towards as part of any principle. Well, then we're saying that service provided in your pharmacy is a safe and effective service. How you decide to implement it or operationalise it or meet those standards and those indicators is within your gift as a pharmacist. But you constantly need to be thinking about the service that you provide being safe, effective, is what you're doing in the public interest. And if you meet those principles and those indicators, I suppose it's the equivalent of a checklist, albeit at a much higher level, and supporting different types of activity in different pharmacies, in different settings.
Okay. What I've heard so far, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's a definitive move away towards saying to pharmacists you have to stand independently, remain within the confines of your expected professionalism within the regulator's requirements. And within that, then, that you have to decide how you can best provide that service, provided you tick the correct things within that principles framework.
Meet the indicators.
Yeah, okay. So in moving forward then, the PSI recently did their strategy. What is it that, as a pharmacist out there, that I need to be very cognizant of going forward in the strategy and the impact that could have on me, not maybe this year, next year, the following year, and I guess be prepared for the changes or the expectations coming down the line to us?
Yeah, so we're 75% the way through the development of the next corporate strategy. So it's intended to run from the period 2025 to 2028. And I suppose in developing the strategy, we're very mindful that a lot of this strategy is actually being dictated by external happenings, and the PSI needs to respond to those. So the first of those activities is us responding and implementing and operationalising the recommendations of the expert task force, and also recognising that there is huge advancements within the e-health or the digital health space. So from a pharmacist perspective, we're looking to regulate pharmacists and pharmacies. So this is the objective: regulate pharmacists and pharmacies to deliver the essential and expanded pharmacy services within the healthcare system. So what can pharmacists expect from recommendation, or from our first objective? So we'll be seeking to implement the recommendations of the task force that will be applicable over that 4-year period. So we know from the Minister and the Department of Health that the intention is to implement common conditions and operationalise the common condition service as quickly as possible. Within the time frame as well, I suppose we can expect movement, albeit it's a medium to longer term objective, movement towards us establishing the regulatory and governance frameworks around independent autonomous pharmacist prescribing. Within the e-health space then, we'll be preparing pharmacists, within their own practice, be prepared for e-prescribing, and to actually, to be able to access and utilise a shared care record. So key to independent autonomous pharmacist prescribing is the appropriate infrastructure. And part of that infrastructure has to be that pharmacists have access and can use shared care record. The other thing within that objective is us operationalising and implementing a number of the short and medium, and indeed starting some of the long-term objectives in the Workforce Intelligence Report. So there's quite a number of those projects within the Workforce Intelligence Report that will be met by implementing the recommendations of the task force, and also a number of them that will be met by ensuring that, I suppose, the e-health initiatives that are planned over the next number of years are implemented as well. The second objective then is around, and you've touched off it, and I suppose we do want to sort of talk to you about it, is around us modernising our regulatory approach and to successfully achieve our strategic priorities and core responsibilities within that approach. So from a PSI perspective, and we have published a paper on this around advancing the reform of the Pharmacy Act, we consider the Pharmacy Act to be quite outdated, albeit that the Act was only implemented in 2007. And the Act was written at a time and just slightly before, I suppose, the report on the Commission for Patient Safety was published. And the Act very much focuses on the safe supply of medicines, and it doesn't actually focus on the safe supply of a pharmacy service to a patient or the public. Now, of course, medicines is an integral part of that service, but it's much more, if you look at how services are provided, how do we ensure the quality of that service? How do we ensure that that's a safe service? So the Act is not written to support that. And also our fitness to practice processes are quite draconian. And a number of the other regulators, the Nursing and Midwifery Board, the Medical Council, did receive additional powers under the Regulated Professions Act in 2020. And we're now seeking reform, and we've started an engagement process with the Department of Health to reform aspects of the Act to give us some of those powers that some of the other regulators have had. And that should streamline the fitness to practice process, but also make that fitness to practice process more efficient. However, we're also going to work on the non-legislative aspects of the fitness to practice process. So we've spoken about the theme of compassionate regulation. The fitness to practice process, for anyone who's gone through it, is extremely stressful. And it's also quite a long process. So from the point of, a complaint being made by a complainant to the point of that complaint process being finished, you could be 3 or more years potentially. And what we're trying to do as part of compassionate regulation, it's not about sugarcoating the fact that a complaint has been made. It's not reducing, or it's not in any way saying that they're, or trying to say that we're not recognising that there could be risk there. Yeah. But what we are recognising is that there is both a complainant and there's a registrant. And for both the complainant and the registrant, this is a complicated and difficult process. So looking at introducing a more humane approach to the fitness to practice process. So from a PSI perspective, that's looking at how we can support registrants and complainants as part of that process. So we're considering the establishment of a contact centre for both registrants and complainants, so that there is somebody that they can speak to outside of colleagues within PSI to support them through the complaints process. Looking at our language, now it's a legal process, so as soon as a fitness to practice complaint is made, you enter a legal process. But how can we support registrants through this legal process in a more compassionate way? So looking at the language of our communication. Equally, I suppose from a registrant's perspective, and again, this is where the point of contact and support comes in, understanding what might be a relevant outcome or a possible outcome of a complaint. So the council would have met with Dr. Anna van der Gaag during one of the training and development sessions last March. And Dr. van der Gaag said, one of the most powerful things you could do to support a registrant through fitness to practice is, I suppose, support them by saying, with the type of complaint that we have in front of us, this is a possible likely outcome. Because I suppose invariably you go to the nth degree when you think about a complaint having been made against you, to think that as a registrant, you might have your registration cancelled, for example. And that really is, a very rare circumstance to happen. But it's about supporting, as I said, the registrant and the complainant, recognising that it's a very stressful process for both, and supporting the registrant and the complainant in a more humane way.
Okay. You mentioned there that you're looking, obviously, the Pharmacy Act, maybe pharmacies move much more quickly than everyone thought, because it wasn't the last one in the last century or 2 centuries ago, that it needs modification and changes. You touched on the piece around the way fitness to practice works. From your kind of perspective, and I know it's impossible to often put timelines on how law changes, do you see a process of the way that you'll have pharmacists out there who have complaints thrown into the PSI because they didn't sell a Solpadeine pack to someone, for example, and it has to go through this I'm going to use the word tedious, I appreciate that I shouldn't be saying that in front of the registrar, but a tedious process of backing and forth with correspondence, and knowing that everything that was done on the pharmacy side, where you have looked at it, has been done to the best of abilities. Will there be anything vexatious complaints, that a process where they don't escalate upwards, and it's a much more a process where a board, whatever, within PSI kind of look at this and kind of go, there's really no substance to this, we're not even going to pursue it? Or is it more that these will all still come through, but it will be just a process where there's a support service in the background for the registrant and the complainant? Sorry, very long-winded question there.
No, not at all. So if we get the amendment that the Medical Council and the Nursing and Midwifery Board have, which were introduced during the Regulated Professions Act, that allows the triaging of complaints at an earlier stage. And that triaging can happen at my level, the Registrar Chief Officer. So you would have to risk assess each of those complaints, but you'd invariably, in the example that you've used, where Solpadeine may not have been, or was not supplied, for all the right reasons, it wasn't an appropriate indication for the supply of Solpadeine, you would in those circumstances expect that complaint could be triaged at the level of the registrar, the chief officer, and that complaint wouldn't take as long to go through the process. If we can get some of those powers, we would expect that to be a much faster process. The other thing that was achieved through those regulations for the other regulators was the acceptance of undertakings at an earlier stage. We find quite often, where mistakes are made, where a complaint has been made, the pharmacist will recognise, that there is some form of undertaking they might want to give at that point, in terms of maybe carrying out additional continuing professional development, ensuring the appropriate mitigating factors are put in place to prevent a reoccurrence of that type of error. And in those circumstances, we'd also hope that we'd be able to accept undertakings at a much earlier stage. Now, this is a process that needs to be developed, but I suppose we can see from the other regulators that this process is working. And therefore, I suppose we'd be confident that we would be able to implement a similar process within PSI, assuming we're given the appropriate powers.
Okay, so as a practicing pharmacist, as you know, that would appear that a much better process than the current one that exists. So I think that part and change of the Pharmacy Act would be quite a significant support, I think, to registrants. Whilst I appreciate the whole purpose and scope is protection of the public, I think from a pharmacist's perspective, talking to you as the registrar, is that there's also the registrant who's there, who's under extreme stress and pressures you've seen in the past and understand. So to move on from that is, how I'm sure you're continuously bombarded all the time with we want this legislation changed, PSI, why can't you do it? I don't understand, it affects my daily practice. I'll throw examples at you and you can tell me to stop. So for example, controlled drug register, the continuation of handwriting of that, you knowing for a fact as an organisation going out doing inspections in pharmacies, it's one of the areas that's always cited back to pharmacies post-inspection that there may be an issue with it. It's probably one of the most common areas, that and temperature logging. Yet when you look and read into the legislation, it has to be handwritten, signed in and out. How do you anticipate all of that changing? Because I know that a lot of people think that's within the scope of the PSI, but in actual fact, it's outside your scope. All you can do is influence it. So can you explain how that works? Just for people to understand that often when you get challenged to these things, you'd love to do it, but there's challenges or barriers or issues, little speed bumps that have to be gotten over in order to change it.
Yeah, and I suppose, that's one of the areas that the PSI needs to communicate better with registrants. So for registrants to understand what's within the scope of PSI's influence to change. And I appreciate that can be very frustrating for a registrant because they see the PSI as being the person who can solve all these issues. However, I suppose in the context of where we're moving forward to in the digital health space, we also need to consider, and again, I suppose I think about the digital health space, but also back to the workforce intelligence report. Yeah. It's a key area of stress for pharmacists. So this regulatory and administrative burden is a key area of stress for pharmacists. Also, it increases or decreases efficiency within the pharmacy. And it presents and you've just rightly pointed out, areas of non-compliance, which are unintentional. So I suppose the legislation in terms of looking at software validation, which most pharmacists will be aware of, is within the Department of Health's remit. But as part of the recommendations on the Workforce Intelligence Report, we're looking to validate the various pharmacy applications, software applications within pharmacy. And when that validation exercise has been carried out, and we can say that each of the software systems meets a certain standard, and those standards have to be developed, we'll be in a position in order to be able to say that these records can be kept electronically. So, for example, your daily audit, your duty register, your controlled drug register, your fridge temperature logs. So that's step one, actually getting the standards put in place for software validation. The Irish Pharmacy Union have done a huge amount of work in this. The Irish College of General Practitioners does this work on behalf of the GP software systems. And the second piece then is amending the legislation, because the Pharmacy Act prescribes that there need to be paper records kept, and these paper records need to be retained for a period of time, and then that goes into our secondary legislation. So we're one of the stakeholders but we're not the only stakeholder.
And
However,
I
it's a
think,
key
Joanne, that's probably what pharmacists only see, is that you are the stakeholder and that you're the owner, but you're not.
We're not. But I appreciate the frustration by pharmacists. I know what it's like to be in a pharmacy and to have whole walls of paperwork. But that paperwork needs to be retained for other reasons, other for compliance with the Pharmacy Act and the various regulations underneath it. It's also needed there from a PCRS perspective in terms of both a probity and a reimbursement perspective. So there's multiple stakeholders here. So when we're looking at the development of standards for pharmacy software systems, there's a number of key stakeholders. PSI, the department, the HSE, PCRS, to name but a few, as well as the software providers themselves. We have met with the Standards Development Officer, wrong name, in the Irish College of General Practitioners. I suppose something to be mindful of there was, in terms of the standards, it caused some of the software developers to leave the market in terms of having to meet the standards was too significant a challenge. And also it can prohibit others from coming into the market in terms of trying to meet the standards. That's one of the risks associated with it. But it's a key area, key priority area for all the stakeholders I mentioned, for PSI, the Department of Health, and HSE, PCRS. And in order to progress with e-prescribing, we need to have those standards in place. So I expect to be having a conversation with you in a number of years, and they're shorter rather than longer, saying that there's progress being made on this area in terms of software validation, and then the associate legislation that will mean that those records can be kept electronically rather than being required to be kept in a paper-based format. So I don't want to give a time frame.
So I don't want to take on my party hat then and celebrate that, no.
I would take out a party hat within the next 2 to 3 years. I can't
Okay.
imagine it being much longer than that.
Okay.
Based on the imperative to have a shared care record and e-prescribing in place over the next number of years.
And I guess that comes from the European directives around having that whole piece around e-prescribing. Is it by 2030, or there's like a timeline given to it?
There is a timeline there, yeah.
It's always reaching, we're getting closer and closer. So just the e-prescribing piece, that in itself is an area that we hear. There's I know that the department recently issued a lovely document on e-prescribing and e-health and how that would look. Do you see that moving quite rapidly, like in the next in the next 2 to 3 years? Or do you still see that there's still a lot of kind of infrastructural work? And what I mean by that is, whilst I appreciate you're not IT, but I mean in the IT background that everyone wants to do it, but do we have actually the infrastructural work to do it and the expectation of what that e-health? Because you talk about shared records. I'm even thinking if I'm a pharmacist and let's say I'm prescribing, I'm going off into 5-10 years in the future and I'm prescribing, to notify that onto the patient's record, how all of that would be done I'm even thinking from a security perspective. All of these things are coming. Do we have even the infrastructure, or what type of infrastructure will be required, and investment into that infrastructure?
Yeah, well, there is, an e-health working group within the department. There's the analogous working group and programs within the HSE. I would see that happening within the next 5 years, maybe earlier. The intention is to procure for an e-health system. My understanding is next year. So we will be,
that's moving quite quickly then, in this grand scheme of things.
In the grand scheme of things, I suppose we've been talking about it for a very, very long time. I mean, I've been, I'm on the register 23 years this year. We were talking about e-prescribing back then. So it's taken a long time. It's been a long time in development. But for independent autonomous pharmacist prescribing, we have to have that infrastructure in place. So that's key to that. So there are a number of steps that will have to be taken. Obviously, the training and education of pharmacists, the appropriate legislative and regulatory frameworks. But in order for pharmacists to be able to prescribe within the community pharmacy sector, we have to have access to and be able to use a national shared care record. From a patient safety perspective, from a communications perspective, interprofessional communication, that infrastructure is essential in order to be able to deliver on that.
And I guess we're back to the whole digitalisation piece. Having a greater digitalisation within that sector, within our own sector, and I know a lot of pharmacists say we're highly digitalised compared to other sectors, but it would allow for innovations that currently may not be allowed. It would allow for greater scope of utilising a pharmacist professionally rather than just as a dispenser. And that's not being derogatory to myself, but in the sense that we're seen as a much more, I have more available time and space to talk to a patient rather than trying to sort out somebody's script through paper or trying to get a claim through in the back. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. It's going to increase the efficiency of care. It's going to help pharmacists with their decision making. How often, as a practicing pharmacist, do you look at prescription and go, well, that drug could be used for multiple issues, and you're trying to deduce potentially from other medications that are being prescribed as to what is the condition that's being treated. So access to shared care record, appropriate access.
Yeah.
Again, this is, within the patient's gift in order to be able to decide how much information can be given to the various healthcare professionals, will support pharmacists in being able to take on those additional roles of being both a diagnostician and being able to prescribe medicines, as well as actually improving the whole dispensing process. Those advancements are key in order to be able to expand that scope. We could at the moment look at prescribing by pharmacists within the hospital sector, because for most of the hospitals, they have their own e-health systems. And again, if you were to look at pharmacist roles, potentially if a model of care is established or created around pharmacists working within the GP surgery, again, a pharmacist will have access to a wide range of, huge amount of information there. But within the community environment, not having access to a shared care record is a significant barrier to us implementing independent autonomous prescribing as it stands at the moment.
Okay. So I guess I'm going to go back all the way to you're in post, how long in?
21 months.
21 months. So in the 21 months you've been there, from my perspective, speaking to you, I would say there's been huge changes to pharmacy in those 21 months. Whilst I appreciate work is happening. So in the next, it's usually a 5-year term, would that be? That's correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you approximately have 3 years left. So in the next 3 years, what are your intentions and your requirements that you would like the profession maybe not necessarily step up to, but to be involved with to progress ourselves from your perspective as the registrar of our professional regulatory body?
I would like to see pharmacists, and I appreciate there will be, and we had this, we spoke about this very earlier in our conversation. Not every pharmacist will want to take on these expanded scopes. But I would like pharmacists who are confident, and all should be confident and capable of doing it because their skills, they have the appropriate skills and competencies to do so, to embrace these changes. So by embracing the extension of prescriptions from 6 to 12 months, will give pharmacists the opportunity to prepare themselves for prescribing for common conditions. And then ultimately, for those who decide to take that next step, to prepare to become independent autonomous prescribers. I see each of these as a stepwise on the route to becoming independent autonomous prescribers within, their specific scope of practice. So within a community pharmacy, for example, you might feel that, I'm very confident to prescribe for gout, but I may not be very confident to prescribe for diabetes. So we'll be working with pharmacists and preparing them and training them in order to be able to, to become independent prescribers. So from my perspective, I would like pharmacists to embrace these changes. We can see from the Workforce Intelligence Report, career satisfaction certainly was in 2023. And again, most of the recommendations of the task force hadn't been announced or hadn't been accepted by the minister at the time of the 2024 survey. Well, end of 2023, published in 24, we can see the career satisfaction was a key area for pharmacists where they want to expand their scope. With that expanded scope comes increased accountability. And taking the various steps, prescription extension, prescribing for common conditions, will prepare pharmacists for that significant next step to becoming independent autonomous prescribers. I appreciate that there will be those who don't want to take on those roles, but it is a huge opportunity. The evidence base is there internationally that pharmacists, prescribers, in terms of outcomes for patients, just as effective, just as safe, and indeed in some areas such as antimicrobial resistance, pharmacists, have shown to be, very authoritative in that area and very supportive of antimicrobial resistance measures. So the evidence is there to support that this has been done and is being done very safely and effectively in other jurisdictions. And I would like pharmacists to consider that as they go through those various stages of growth, going from your comfort zone into that area of fear, moving then into that area of learning, and then ultimately growth, because that's what it is about. It's moving from our comfort zone into new areas and ultimately growing as professionals.
And I guess that from the perspective that that would be like a legacy piece, but also then if you're bringing in the compassionate regulations behind that from as a pharmacist perspective, would I think allow, maybe permit pharmacists like to take that journey, because I think professionally from my own perspective is that when I qualified 30 years ago, you went out and you just dispensed medicines and that's all you really did. Whereas this is a whole different avenue, and I think it's opening up an avenue where a lot of us who have been experienced for quite a long time would have felt kind of like stymied when you see something in front of you kind of going, I'm sending this person somewhere else and I really could look after it here. And I guess that's where we need to move towards. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. I think pharmacists are doing a lot of this already, and we don't recognise that we're doing it. So in terms of a common condition and the 8 that have recently been announced, pharmacists today are engaging with patients, providing them with advice, safety netting in circumstances where the condition may not be resolved, recommending a medication over the counter, or if it can't be treated by an over the counter medication, referring them on to their GP. So pharmacists are doing all the steps currently. Now, diagnosing is quite different to dispensing. So there is a new skill set that will need to be learned there, and we will support pharmacists through the appropriate training and education to develop those skills. For a lot of pharmacists, they're currently carrying out all those steps. What we're doing in common conditions is expanding the number of medications that are available for pharmacists. They will be prescription-only medicines that pharmacists will be able to prescribe from a protocol of medicines to treat these common conditions. And it's very much within the skill set and competence of pharmacists at the moment, because pharmacists are currently doing this every single day as part of their role.
So, okay, and I promise I'll finish soon. So I'm quite happy to extend prescriptions. Like I've done it during COVID. You just take into account the individual in front of you. So I go on to my common conditions. Like how many years of training am I going to have to undertake in order to start prescribing, diagnosing for these common conditions? Some of them are like we do anyway, if you know what I mean, every day with other products. So am I going to be spending like 48 years trying to train up to get to the common conditions to be able to prescribe, supply these items? Or is there somebody going to be innovative out there and say, well, actually, it's been done in Canada, the UK, to name just two, that, oh, well, maybe, they did it quite simply. Why do we have to complicate it?
Yes, so the Minister for Health has established a Community Pharmacy Expansion Implementation Oversight Group, which will be now known as the Implementation Oversight Group, or the IOG, to look at introducing common conditions. And the Minister is quite ambitious about the time frame that he would like common conditions to be provided in community pharmacies, and that is winter, this upcoming winter. So we're currently part of that implementation oversight group, a number of colleagues on PSI, and looking at the various protocols that need to be developed for common conditions, together with the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Clinical Officer, colleagues from the IPU are involved, HSE, PCRS, etc., practicing pharmacists as well. The intention is, and you've rightly pointed out, that for a number of these common conditions, we're already treating them within the pharmacy, is that appropriate quality assured continuing professional development will be developed for these conditions and to support pharmacists as part of their training. So the expectation is that you will log on to a webinar or you'll carry out a course of continuing professional development through the Irish Institute of Pharmacy for the various common conditions. So this will not be a level 9 postgraduate qualification, albeit that is what will be required for independent autonomous pharmacist prescribing. But for prescribing for common conditions, following a defined protocol and using a number of prescribed medicines as part of a schedule under that protocol, the expectation is that pharmacists will carry out continuing professional development.
So, Joanne, you mentioned there that the minister is proactive. What happens when that changes and we have a whole new minister? Will pharmacy then fall off the table and something else be their kind of piece that they're interested in? How is that going to be managed going forward? Because we know there's going to be a change one way or the other.
Well, I think the die has been cast, Denis, and we spoke earlier about the role that pharmacists have played during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there is a recognition that the role that pharmacists can play as part of the integrated healthcare system. And if you think about the role that pharmacists will be playing as part of extending prescriptions and prescribing for common conditions, for example, it's about ensuring that patients have access to the right care in the right place at the right time. So if I'm a patient and I need to be treated for shingles, for example, going to my community pharmacy to be diagnosed with shingles, I can do that more than likely in a much more timely manner than I may be able to get a GP appointment. You're therefore freeing up capacity, if you think about it in the context of other conditions, more chronic conditions that may need to be supported or patients need to attend for their GPs. And you're also should be expecting to reduce the overall cost, and also there should be a situation whereby equity of access is achieved. So that all aligns with the principles of Sláinte care. So I would see the role of the pharmacist being recognised by any future Minister for Health in the context of what's intended to be achieved under Sláinte care, which is about reducing complexity, increasing access, making sure that we have equity of access for our patients, and where patients are visiting the appropriate healthcare professional at the lowest level of complexity. So I would hope that any new Minister for Health, would see the recommendations of the task force. It's a very strong evidence-based report, and I know that both ourselves within PSI, colleagues within the departments themselves, our advocacy bodies such as the IPU will be engaging with any new Minister for Health with the intention of ensuring that this expanded scope is delivered upon.
Okay, so I'm going to close out now shortly. So my last question to you, Joanne, is that if in the morning you had the magic wand, what is it that you think would be one of the best things to do for pharmacy as it currently stands? If you could do anything, what would it be from a regulatory perspective? What would it be that would be what you would see as, even from the perspective of the regulator, kind of like groundbreaking? Whilst I appreciate lots is happening, what would be like completely like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened?
I actually can't believe a lot of what has happened over the last 21 months. I think we've been talking about it for a very, very long time. If I had a magic wand tomorrow, I definitely would look at reforming the Act. That would be a sea change for us. I mean, we've spoken about amending fitness to practice processes, but also looking at how we might get standards as part of our own functions, which would help us further in supporting pharmacists in delivering quality assured services, but also from a patient and public perspective, allows us to quality assure those services in a much more effective and safe manner. I mean, we're constantly acting in the public interest. That's our role. And I think changes to the Pharmacy Act, and we've multiple changes that we require, would be, for us as a pharmacy regulator, a significant improvement on the Act that we currently have. Okay,
that's fantastic. I think from my perspective as a pharmacist that's an alignment that I wouldn't have perceived, if that makes sense, that a lot of pharmacists complain about the Act. So knowing that the regulator equally sees that this needs to be done in order to make accessibility, us to move along professionally, and the public to get the safest possible care is really ultimately reform of the Pharmacy Act. So on that note, I'd like to thank Joanne Kissane, the Registrar of the Pharmaceutical Society, for coming onto our podcast today, and hopefully that everyone has got something from this. Thanks a million. Take care.
Thanks for the opportunity, Denis.